Ever since I was a kid, I learned that some families don't need to scream or hit to make you feel unwanted. Sometimes they just leave without you, quietly, consistently, until the absence becomes louder than any words could ever be. And that was exactly how my childhood felt every time my mom, dad, and my older sister packed their bags for yet another family vacation, while I stood in the hallway holding the list of chores they'd need done while we're away, pretending I didn't care when in truth, my heart sank deeper each year. They'd come home sunburned and laughing, carrying souvenirs for each other, while I stayed behind cleaning the house like a live-in maid who happened to share their last name. And each time I asked why I wasn't invited, the answer was always some version of, someone has to stay and take care of things, as if I wasn't a child wanting memories too, but a backup generator meant to keep the house running. And the worst part wasn't even the exclusion. It was how normal it became for them, how easy it was for them to erase me from everything that looked like joy. How at 12, I stopped waiting by the window on the day they were supposed to return. How at 14, I stopped asking to come along. And how by the time I turned 17, I had already accepted the role they carved for me, the overlooked daughter, the one whose job was to be useful, quiet, available. I carried that wound into adulthood like a scar I couldn't scrub off. And even when I moved out at 20 and built my own life from scratch, they still treated me as the responsible helper rather than an equal, calling me only when they needed money, advice, or free labor, never when they were celebrating something. So when I finally landed a well-paying job in a tech firm after years of studying alone, working double shifts and pushing myself harder than anyone ever pushed my sister, my family didn't congratulate me. They barely reacted, as if my achievements were expected while hers were worshipped. And for a long time, I let it slide because part of me still craved even the smallest scrap of belonging. But then, one winter, everything shifted. Not slowly, but like a sudden crack in ice that makes you realize the entire lake beneath you was never safe. It started on Christmas Eve, the one day I still naively believed they'd include me in, because what kind of family forgets their own daughter on Christmas? Apparently mine does, because I waited like a fool, dressed and ready, with a small wrapped gift in my lap, expecting my mom to call or at least send the address for the dinner, but instead I saw a family photo on my sister's Instagram. My parents, my sister, her boyfriend, all smiling in front of a holiday cabin 4 hours away, and the caption read, "Family Christmas tradition, couldn't imagine it any other way." And that was the moment my chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt since childhood, a familiar ache that reminded me that no matter how old you get, being left out by the people who raised you still hits in the same raw place. But instead of crying or calling them to ask why, I simply sat there and let the numbness wash over me. And by morning, something inside me had shifted, not broken, but hardened, sharpened into something that felt terrifyingly calm. I blocked their numbers for a week and focused on myself, my work, my peace. And during that time, I made a decision that would become the beginning of the revenge they never saw coming. Not the loud, destructive kind, but the quiet, elegant kind that comes from rising so far above the people who belittled you that your success becomes the mirror they're forced to look into. Months later, when my company awarded me a massive bonus for leading a project that no one believed I could handle, I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. Not to buy their affection, but to honor the two people who actually raised me, my grandmother's best friends, Mr. and Mrs. Turner, an elderly couple from down the street who took me in during summers, fed me when my parents traveled, and treated me like family even though we weren't related. I booked a $28,000 Maldives villa for them and for myself, planning a once-in-a-lifetime trip to thank them for the love my own parents never gave me. And while I didn't intend for my family to find out, fate works strangely sometimes, because one accidental post, one harmless photo of the Turners smiling in front of turquoise waters, was enough for my phone to explode with messages from my mother, my father, and even my sister, demanding to know why I would waste that kind of money on strangers and why I didn't think of the real family first. And I swear I laughed Actually, they cared about missing out on something expensive, something luxurious, something Instagram-worthy. And for the first time, I didn't respond with guilt or excuses, just silence. Beautiful, peaceful silence. Because deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of a reckoning they thought I'd never be brave enough to give them. I didn't speak to my parents for 3 weeks after that night, partly because I was tired of being the forgotten daughter who only existed when they were bored, but mostly because their sudden surge of interest in my Maldives trip smelled like danger, not affection. And I wasn't stupid enough to overlook the pattern I'd spent my entire life suffocating under. Yet somehow the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It felt like waiting for storm clouds to burst, and when the first crack came, it was in the form of a text message from my mother. 3 words, cold and careful: "We need you." And immediately my chest tightened because people who genuinely need you don't choose silence as punishment for independence. And realizing that broke something in me I didn't know could still break. But I didn't reply. Not because I wanted revenge yet, but because I wanted to see what they would do without having access to the version of me that always came running. They lasted 40 hours before my father called, voice thick with manufactured urgency, claiming my sister, the golden child who once called me the optional sibling, was overwhelmed with wedding planning and needed help choosing a venue. And hearing them try to drag me back into the same old dynamic, her sparkle, my servitude, was the moment something inside me snapped so quietly I barely recognized the sound. Yet the crack ran deep enough to reroute the entire story of who I was becoming. Because I remembered every detail: the years they left me behind while they took her on vacations, the birthdays they gift-wrapped disappointment and called it budget constraints while she got new iPhones, the time she laughed at me in front of her friends because I wore the same worn sneakers for 2 years, the echo of my mother saying, "You know your sister deserves more, she's our shining one," as if I were a backup character in my own home. All of it flooded back and hardened my resolve like cooling steel. So when my father said, "You should help your sister, you owe the family that much," I almost laughed, truly laughed, because the absurdity was unreal. I owed them nothing. They owed me years of apologies they had never even attempted. So I told him I was busy with work, and he responded with a strained sigh that said he wasn't used to being denied. He was used to obedience, to my invisibility, to controlling a daughter who didn't fight back. But this version of me, the one who booked a Maldives villa on her own terms, was not the girl they raised to be small. And that's when the shift began. My sister started texting, first guilt, then manipulation, then petty anger when I didn't fall in line. "It's just one thing. Why can't you stop being difficult?" And "It's like you want to ruin my big day." And then the final blow: "Honestly, Mom and Dad said you're acting jealous again." Again. As if jealousy had been my only defining trait growing up. As if they hadn't engineered that jealousy themselves. As if I had ever wanted her life. But it wasn't jealousy I felt. It was grief. The kind that comes from realizing your own family never intended to love you the way you loved them. And with grief came clarity. They weren't reaching for me, they were reaching for my usefulness, my labor, my silence. Yet the more they pushed, the more I pulled away. And the more I pulled away, the more their panic showed. It escalated when they began calling from different numbers, leaving voicemails disguised as concern, but underneath the words I heard fear, real fear, the kind that said my absence disrupted something fundamental in their dynamic, because every system needs a scapegoat, and without me, the cracks in their perfect family portrait began to show. Then came the day everything shifted. My boss called me into her office, smiled, and offered me a promotion, senior project strategist, along with a bonus large enough to make my savings jump significantly. And something inside me whispered that this wasn't just good news. This was alignment, preparation, the universe sliding puzzle pieces into place for something bigger that I could see. Because as I walked home with the promotion letter in my bag, I saw the message from my mother lighting up my phone. "We need to talk, it's urgent." And I knew instantly that whatever was coming next wouldn't be simple. It would be the beginning of the moment they finally realized the daughter they overlooked, underestimated, and emotionally starved had grown into someone they could no longer control. And that terrified them. They still thought they had access. They still thought I was available. They still thought I would fold. But the Maldives villa I was planning, the one I hadn't told them about yet, was not just a vacation. It was going to be the beginning of my reclamation, the beginning of the end of their entitlement. Because little did they know, this time, when they tried to claim a piece of my life, they were walking straight into the last lesson I'd ever let them take from me. When I opened the villa door that morning, the same Maldives villa my family had mocked me for booking alone, the same place they barged into only when they needed warmth, food, and a free luxury vacation, I felt something shift inside me, something final and irreversible, like a door that had been rusting shut for years, finally sealing for good. Because after everything that happened over the last 2 days, the arguments, the fake apologies, the guilt traps, the confessions they didn't realize I overheard, I finally understood the truth I avoided for most of my life. I had spent years begging for love from people who only saw me as a backup plan, a wallet, a punching bag, an emotional dumpster, someone whose softness could be weaponized and whose forgiveness could be milked. And it took this trip, this absurd, beautiful, painful trip, for the denial to evaporate. It took watching my parents and sister fight over who would sleep in the master bedroom, who deserved which dinner, who was owed more after raising me, to realize that their version of family wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as they designed it. A hierarchy where I lived at the bottom, staying grateful for crumbs while they feasted. So when I sat them down on the villa deck overlooking the ocean, the air warm and gentle as the waves whispered against the stilts, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't shaking. I was just done. And I told them in one breath, without raising my voice, without even trying to make it dramatic, "You will not be staying here tonight." And the way their faces twisted, first in shock, then in offense, then in that familiar, manipulative sadness, was almost predictable, like rehearsed lines in a play they'd been performing for decades. My mother clutched her chest, claiming I was breaking the family. My father frowned like I had insulted his very identity. And my sister, always the actress, let out a tear she could summon on command, saying I was overreacting and misremembering things and needed to stop making everything about trauma. But I didn't fight back, didn't justify, didn't remind them that I had overheard them the first night whispering about how they'd take advantage of the free trip and pretend to reconcile until they get what they want. Didn't bring up the way my mother had said I got lucky instead of successful. Didn't repeat the moment my father laughed that money didn't fix personality. Didn't expose that my sister tried to steal my villa confirmation code to extend her own stay after I left. Instead, I simply told them the truth in the calmest voice I've ever used. You don't get access to me anymore. And for the first time in my life, the silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was freeing, like a window opening after years of stale air. And maybe that's why they panicked, why my mother grabbed my arm, why my sister started shouting that I was cruel, why my father demanded to know who I thought I was. Because for them, my worth had always been tied to how much pain I could absorb without pushing back, how bendable I was, how much of myself I was willing to shrink so they could take up more space. But that version of me had died somewhere between the airport chaos, the whispered insults, and the moment I watched them treat my generosity as a right instead of a gift. So I walked them to the door, handed them the number for the resort's regular rooms, no overwater villas, no private pools, nothing luxurious, and listened as they scrambled, first bargaining, then yelling, then guilt-tripping, then begging, each stage like a chapter in a book I had finally stopped reading. And when they realized I wasn't going to budge, my father muttered something about never speaking again. My mother said she felt sorry for me, and my sister hissed that I was pathetic without family, but I didn't react. Not with anger, not with sadness, not with triumph, just stillness. Because by then, I knew that losing people who never valued you is not a loss, it's a correction. And when the door shut behind them, the villa felt different, lighter, like it finally belonged to me. And I stepped onto the deck, letting the ocean wind press against my skin, breathing in the peace that always felt out of reach. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like an afterthought. I felt whole. And as the sun dropped into the water, painting the sky with gold and violet streaks, I realized that revenge doesn't always roar, doesn't always destroy, doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes revenge is simply removing access, stepping out of the role they wrote for you, building a life so solid, so joyful, so authentically yours that the people who tried to break you no longer have the privilege of witnessing it. And with that thought, I raised a glass of cold coconut water towards the horizon, not for them, but for the version of me who survived long enough to become this one, and whispered the softest truth I've ever spoken. I finally chose myself.